Hey guys, it's Rameyoutdoors and welcome back to Fishing College. Have you ever been in one of these situations where you've gotten your crankbait or another lure stuck in a tree? Maybe it's on a log underwater. Maybe it's in another area. Well, today we're going to make it so you don't look like that trying to get your lure out of the tree, potentially breaking your rod tip, getting a crankbait, treble hook stuck in your eye, and other uneventful things that you may not want to happen. Remember to go ahead and like and subscribe, and let's get right to it. One of the first things that you really need to assess is how are you snagged? Are you snagged in a tree? Are you snagged on something that's underwater? Are you able to pull it at all? Is it immobile? Things like that. For example, if you're snagged in a tree like I am, just simply walk around and untangle yourself. That's the most easy way to get it done. But say that you're snagged somewhere underwater or you're snagged somewhere that may not be very accessible, that might be a little bit more difficult. And we're going to get into that on a later part of the video. First obstacle that we're going to talk about is trees. And that's something that is almost unavoidable if you are fishing in really windy areas or you're fishing in, like, for example, really small confined areas that may not have the best casting range. So the first thing that you're going to look at is possibly getting hooked on a main area and your line's just tied around. If you are able to access where you're snagged, just simply walk over and untangle it. Not that bad. Now say that you're unable to access that. That might be a little bit of a different story. So what we're trying to do here is to potentially get unsnagged without getting any kind of breakage on your rod or any kind of excess damage that might kind of add insult to injury. First thing that a lot of people are going to resort to is going to be popping their rod tip and trying to actually get themselves unsnagged. And while that can be effective, that can add a lot of stress to your rod tip, which can sometimes end up snapping it, breaking it, or what can end up happening is that that crankbait might be coming back at you at 100 miles an hour, and that's not really something that we want. So make sure that you probably have sunglasses on and you probably have some extra clothing on, just so in case that gets, worst come to worst, it gets snagged in your clothes, not in your skin. Because remember, those $300 pair of Costas are a lot more replaceable than having permanent eye damage. What is recommended by a lot of rod manufacturers? So the first thing is going to be to turn your drag about as high as it can go. Next is going to be pulling straight back in line with the actual line and where your snag point is. So if you were just yanking and yanking and yanking, that's adding a lot of stress to that parabolic curve. But this, pulling straight back, is not going to add any stress whatsoever. So while ultimately this may end up having you lose that lure, it's not going to stress that rod very much. So that's if it comes to that, I can't get this lure back, it's completely inaccessible, and I've tried other methods that are further in this video and nothing is working. It's to just pull straight back. And while this will ultimately end up with you probably losing that lure, you can't win them all. You can't always get them back. So let's move into some other methods. So this next method is going to assume that I have casted over something and I have a little bit of wiggle room with that lure and I have an area that I can actually move to that is around that. Let's say that it is an underwater log, or it could even be a rock. But what we're going to assume is that I have casted on one side and the lure has been embedded into whatever it is. So that is what we're going to assume with today. So notice whenever I'm pulling, I'm getting no movement on that lure, except I'm possibly just causing some damage and actually moving it further in. So what are some methods that I can try to potentially get this unstuck? The first one is going to be relaxing tension, because sometimes snags may not be all that bad. And by relaxing tension on a floating bait like a crankbait, its upward pulling action might actually unsnag you. And the fact that it no longer has tension on it might also unsnag you. The next thing is potentially moving around whatever you're snagged on. And using that same method that I told you, pulling straight back and the lure will pop off. So sometimes it does call for a little bit of management, but pulling straight back more often than not can get you that lure back. But there are some instances where that lure is just gone and you have to just call it, either break off or cut your line. Ideally, cutting the line is going to be the best and most resourceful thing that you can do, but sometimes you just have to call it quits. This next method is what I'm going to call guitar strumming. So what you're going to do is you're going to place some tension on your line, and you are going to, almost like you're flipping into cover, pull out some line near the base of the reel. And next you're just going to flick it back. And this might take a couple of attempts, but usually by doing that, that creates enough tension on the rod and it's suddenly letting go that you can get your lure back. And while this isn't a foolproof method, it is something that I do use quite a bit, and it has worked for me quite a lot, especially for whenever I'm using a chatterbait or stuff with single hooks. Oftentimes getting things back with treble hooks can be a little bit of a challenge. Something that can also be really common whenever you're actually jigging blowdowns or things like that is that you can typically get snagged on branches, or you can sometimes get snagged on docks whenever you're skipping them. And so what that calls for is you actually taking your boat or moving closer to it, laying down on the side of the boat and following your line down to where your lure is. And sometimes you can just punch that lure straight out. Now, what that's also going to do is probably ruin your fishing spot. But if that lure means that much to you, it's worth a shot, because sometimes you can usually get that lure out. Sometimes you can usually find a way to get it out, but sometimes just repositioning your boat and almost using like method 2 that I talked about, going around wherever you're snagged and pulling straight back, or just kind of giving it gentle little pops, can sometimes wiggle it free. And using a mixture of the methods I talked about, like strumming that guitar or giving it little pops, pulling straight back and repositioning, sometimes that can be what it needs to be to where you can actually get things free. Because trust me, some of these glide baits that some of these anglers are throwing are going to be $70, $80, $90. We don't want to be losing those. Now, say that you have like a favorite lucky jig or something like that. You probably don't want to lose that either. So using a combination of these methods that I've talked about today can really help. Now, you do have some tools like the Lose Go Get 'em, the Rocket Slug, things like that, that prove really effective. But that's a product. That's not something that we're talking about in this video. So if you want to use a product, that's usually something that you can do and that you can honestly find great success with. But not everyone can afford to go out and just buy a product to solve a problem. I really hope this helps, and as per usual, have fun catching fish, people. Peace.